was the kind of Sunday that felt like nothing could go wrong. The Oklahoma heat had broken slightly, clouds hung loose in the sky, and the congregation at Harvest Creek Baptist was in good spirits. The Alford family had parked just off the gravel lot behind the church that morning, attended service, chatted with neighbors, and helped load supplies for the church's annual summer picnic. Greg, a 39-year-old middle school math teacher, was known as the dependable type, quiet but steady. Marianne, his wife, was warmer, more talkative and active in the church's women's group. Their daughter Tessa, 9 years old with a shy smile and a love for sketching animals, had recently learned to ride her bike without training wheels. They were a normal, well-liked family, never involved in any drama, never drawing attention. By all accounts, they were the last people you'd expect to disappear. The picnic was held near Lake Waurika that year, just over 20 minutes south of town, a scenic spot shaded by cottonwoods and pecans with a wide cove that was popular for fishing and cooling off. Around noon, families began setting up folding chairs and laying out potluck dishes. Greg helped unload tables. Marianne handed out lemonade. Tessa sat with 2 other girls from Sunday school, giggling over a shared pack of markers. At 2:15 p.m., several attendees remembered the Alfords gathering their things. Greg had said they were going for a short walk before heading home. They took their cooler back to the church van to free up space and said they'd return to pick it up later. No one thought anything of it. The walk along the cove was short and well-worn. It wasn't until hours later, when the last of the sunburned families had packed up and headed back to town, that someone noticed the cooler still sitting alone on the church lawn. Calls to their home went unanswered. A neighbor stopped by the Alford house around 7:30 p.m. and saw the porch light off, the blinds still drawn, and both cars gone. At first, people assumed they'd gone to visit relatives or maybe stopped for dinner, but by 10 p.m., Marianne's sister reported them missing. Deputies were dispatched to their home in the lake. The family's Ford Taurus wasn't in the church lot or at the park entrance. Their phones went straight to voicemail. No one could remember them leaving the park by car. The search began that night with a few flashlights and patrol units, but by sunrise it was clear. The family hadn't just left, they had vanished. Local authorities called in volunteers, boats, dogs, and drones. Search teams walked the lake trails in grid patterns. Divers entered the cove. Helicopters scanned for tire tracks. But there was no trace of them, not a shoe, not a water bottle, not a shred of clothing. The picnic site had been cleaned up, but nobody recalled seeing the Alfords return. One boy said he'd seen them near the southern tree line. Another woman mentioned she thought she heard Tessa laughing near the woods, but the memories conflicted. The timeline didn't hold. The Alfords' house showed no signs of packing or stress. Tessa's hamster had been left without food. Dishes from breakfast were still in the sink. Their pastor described the day as unremarkable until it wasn't. As more days passed, frustration and panic gave way to something darker. Detectives checked hospital records, car rental agencies, highway patrol logs. They dug into Greg's finances. They spoke to Marianne's former co-workers. Everything was normal. Nothing suggested trouble. Rumors began to swirl. Maybe Greg snapped. Maybe someone had lured them into the woods. Maybe they were hiding. But why? Why would a family vanish from a sunny Sunday picnic in broad daylight without anyone seeing a thing? Why would their car, full-size, tan, easy to spot, vanish without a single tire mark or witness? The town grew quieter as the weeks wore on. Church members who had once shared Sunday meals now sat stiff in pews, unsure how to speak about the Alfords without revisiting that unbearable silence. Flyers were printed, billboards put up. Tips came in, but none panned out. Every road seemed to dead end into more questions. At one point, a man in Arkansas claimed to have seen a family matching their description at a diner, but security footage proved it wasn't them. Psychics were consulted. A search and rescue specialist from Texas spent 3 days with dogs in the eastern woods, only to report that there was nothing, no scent trail, no signs of struggle. Nothing. What haunted people most was how abrupt it all felt. A sunny day, a picnic, a simple walk, and then just gone. Investigators would later say it was like they'd walked into a fold in the landscape, as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed them whole. But the ground hadn't. The lake hadn't. Time had. The only thing ever found from that day was the unopened white cooler, still packed with drinks and sandwiches, sitting right where they'd left it, sweating in the sun, untouched, waiting. At first, the timeline seemed easy enough to reconstruct. It was a church picnic after all, 40-some people, most of them longtime friends, spread out under trees and tents, watching their kids run between games of tag and soggy watermelon slices. But when investigators started asking specific questions, who saw the Alfords last, what direction they walked, how long they were gone before someone noticed, they ran into something unexpected. Silence, then second-guessing. People remembered the family being there, but not clearly. They remembered a joke Greg made about the heat. They remembered Marianne sharing deviled eggs. They remembered Tessa drawing butterflies in the dirt with a stick. But no one remembered them leaving. No one remembered the moment they stood up and walked away. Investigators focused on the most consistent detail. Multiple people, 4 to be exact, recalled Greg mentioning they were going to stretch their legs before heading home. The time, according to overlapping watches and phone records, was somewhere between 2:25 and 2:35 p.m. After that, they vanished. No one remembered seeing them on the walking trail. No one saw them drive away. No one heard any shouting, footsteps, or unusual commotion. There was no rush of movement, no cry for help. The Ford Taurus they had driven that morning was no longer in the church lot, and it wasn't in the picnic area's limited parking either. It simply wasn't anywhere. The lake itself became the primary suspect. Lake Waurika was vast, muddy, and surrounded by hundreds of acres of thick forest and overgrown trails that hadn't been maintained in years. The idea was simple. Maybe Greg had taken a wrong turn, driven too close to an embankment, and the car had slid into the water. But the terrain didn't support it. There was only one narrow access road, and it was dry, hard-packed gravel. Still, the sheriff's office brought in sonar equipment. Divers spent nearly 3 weeks scanning the lake bed. Visibility was low. The water was murky and full of branches and debris, but no signs of a vehicle were ever found. They ran license plate checks across the state. Nothing. There was one surveillance camera on a pole outside the entrance to the lake grounds, aimed more to monitor park traffic than anything else. It was old and grainy, and its timestamp was off by nearly an hour. But technicians managed to confirm that the Alfords Taurus had entered the park around 10:41 a.m. The vehicle was never seen exiting. No other camera in town caught them. That detail alone chilled the lead detective. In theory, the car should have had to pass through one of 3 exits to get back to town. None of them had footage. None of them logged a sighting. For a while, officers believed maybe the car had been dumped elsewhere, moved during the night, but no one in town had seen or heard anything strange. Rumors started to sprout. A couple claimed they'd heard distant music in the woods around 3 p.m., soft like a handheld radio or wind chime, fading in and out. Others dismissed it as wind through the trees or kids playing with speakers. Someone else thought they saw a figure in orange moving along the ridge, but it turned out to be a hunter. Every odd noise, every shadow became a potential lead. But none of them held. One man even claimed he found a child's sock deep in the woods weeks later, but it was mildew-covered and couldn't be traced to anyone. The last known sighting of the family remained fixed at that one moment, Greg saying they were going for a short walk before heading out. And after that, silence. The church community held prayer circles. Volunteers printed flyers. One family organized a GoFundMe to support extended search efforts. The Alfords' house remained untouched, curtains drawn, a stack of mail building up in the box. Tessa's bedroom, when investigators did a second walkthrough, was haunting in its ordinariness. A half-finished coloring book on the nightstand, a library receipt dated the day before, her hamster still alive in its cage, untouched food pellets in the bowl. Weeks passed. The media lost interest. People stopped asking questions out loud, though they kept asking them in private. No one wanted to admit it, but the story had begun to drift into that space reserved for the unspeakable, as if the less you talked about it, the less it could follow you home. The police scaled back their efforts by late fall, citing lack of evidence. Every trail led nowhere. Every theory collapsed. The Alfords, by official record, became a family of 3 who walked out of a picnic and into nothing. And still, All anyone could do was circle back to the last thing they knew for sure, that they had once been laughing by the lake. And then they weren't. In the absence of answers, people start inventing them. It didn't take long for theories to take root, twisting themselves around the quiet vacuum the Alfords left behind. Some were whispered over fences, others printed in opinion columns. There were those who believed Greg had finally cracked, that beneath his calm, steady exterior was a man slowly unraveling under some unknown weight. Maybe he'd planned it, taken the family off-grid, crossed state lines with new identities. Others pointed to darker places. A few speculated he had harmed them, then himself. That the picnic was a cover for something premeditated. But when investigators returned to the Alford home with those theories in mind, nothing matched. The house was painfully ordinary. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The living room still had the air conditioning running on a timer. Greg's work laptop sat open on the table with unfinished lesson plans. Marianne's purse was on the counter with her wallet still inside. Tessa's bedroom looked lived in, not packed or hurried. Her library books were overdue by 3 days. Financial records were combed through, bank accounts examined line by line. There were no large withdrawals, no purchases of camping gear or storage rentals, no gas station receipts that pointed beyond their regular routine. Their passports hadn't been touched. Nothing had been bought or moved. Friends said they weren't in debt. They weren't having marital issues. There were no signs of substance abuse. Their last known communications, text messages to Marianne's sister and Greg's co-workers, were casual and consistent with someone planning to return home later that day. Nothing about their digital or physical footprint suggested they were preparing to vanish. Still, as the months dragged on, stranger narratives emerged. A few town residents began speculating that the family had gotten involved with something they shouldn't have. Maybe a cult, maybe an isolated religious sect operating in the rural parts of Oklahoma. It wasn't much more than late-night radio talk at first, but then an anonymous letter was sent to the sheriff's office suggesting they look into the group by the river. That tip led nowhere. No group was found, no connection established, but it didn't stop others from believing something had pulled the Alfords away from civilization. Something quiet, methodical, something that didn't leave a trace. The FBI became involved briefly in late 2003. More as a precaution than out of belief that the family had crossed state lines. They checked facial recognition matches against driver's license databases. They flagged interstate bus and train records. They explored the possibility of international travel, but found no airline activity. In time, they closed their case file and handed jurisdiction back to local authorities. The case lacked any of the red flags that usually triggered prolonged federal attention. There were no ransom notes, no credible threats, no criminal histories, no digital breadcrumbs. By early 2004, the only activity surrounding the disappearance came from the people who couldn't let it go. Online forums, amateur sleuths, and paranormal bloggers began crafting elaborate maps and timelines. Some users pointed out a small pattern of disappearances in rural picnic areas across neighboring states, though none were connected with real evidence. One retired detective from Kansas claimed the layout of the picnic site reminded him of a case from the 1980s involving displacement zones, a fringe theory popular among wilderness survivalists. Then, a psychic appeared on a local news segment, claiming she had felt the family's fear, that they'd been swallowed by the trees and separated from time. The segment went viral. For a moment, attention surged again. A group of volunteers returned to the lake with cameras and microphones, hoping for something. Voices, static, anything. But there was nothing. Not a footprint, not a shred of clothing, just wind and insects and silence. Eventually, even the reporters stopped calling. The missing posters faded, water-stained and curling on bulletin boards outside the post office. Church services carried on. The next summer's picnic was smaller, quieter, and moved to a different location altogether. Those who had once offered prayers and casseroles returned to routines. The Alford house was never sold. Marianne's sister paid the taxes and kept it intact, as if at any moment the front door might open again. But by the second anniversary of their disappearance, the community had mostly gone quiet. People still remembered the family, especially Tessa, but they stopped talking about them in public. To some, it felt too painful. To others, Too strange. And just like that, the case that had once stirred a town and puzzled federal investigators began to dim behind the noise of everyday life. There was no headline, no grave, no closure. Just a question that no one could answer. How does a family of 3 walk away from a Sunday picnic and leave behind nothing? It was a dry spring in southern Oklahoma, the kind that turned creeks into trenches and left the land brittle. In March of 2020, a construction crew contracted by the county was dredging a long dormant tributary south of Lake Warrica, clearing silt and debris ahead of a new water diversion project. It was remote, a place most locals never went, swallowed by cedar and oak, unreachable by vehicle. Half the workers didn't even realize how close they were to the site of that long-forgotten church picnic. They were digging 3 feet down into packed earth when a backhoe hit something solid. At first, they assumed it was an old oil drum, nothing uncommon for rural Oklahoma. But when they cracked it open, the smell that came out wasn't petroleum. It was old, musty, wrong. Inside were mostly animal bones, small vertebrae, cracked rib fragments, and what appeared to be a badly decomposed deer skull. But beneath it all, tangled in soil and tufts of matted fur, was something else. A single human rib, unnaturally small. The site was shut down, the area cordoned off. By the next morning, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation had a mobile forensic unit parked at the mouth of the ravine. The bone was rushed to the state medical examiner's office. DNA testing took 10 days. When the results came in, they confirmed what no one had dared to assume for nearly 2 decades. The rib belonged to Tessa Alford. The announcement shook the community. For 17 years, theories had swirled, but none had been anchored by physical proof. Now, there was no question, the family had not run away. Tessa had not grown up under a new name. She hadn't survived. The discovery triggered a chain reaction. Investigators returned to the site with cadaver dogs, thermal drones, and portable ground radar. The terrain had changed since 2003, erosion, wildfires, flooding. But the area where the barrel had been buried was unusually undisturbed. It was almost as if someone had picked the location precisely because it would stay hidden. The fact that the remains had been sealed in an oil drum wasn't lost on anyone. It implied time, planning, and the ability to move something heavy through difficult terrain. The barrel had likely been hauled in by hand or dragged on something. There were no tire tracks, no signs of nearby vehicle access. It had been buried under at least 2 feet of silt, suggesting it had been placed early, possibly not long after the family vanished. The dogs picked up nothing new, no additional remains, no scent trail. Just dead trees, buried roots, and silence. Local residents who had joined the original 2003 search were stunned. The area where the barrel had been found was well outside the grid they'd covered back then. It was miles from the trailhead, beyond a dense patch of thorn and briar that no one had bothered to cut through at the time. One retired volunteer said it would have taken hours on foot just to reach that bend in the creek, and even longer to carry something heavy in or out. Whoever had done this had known the land, and had gone to great lengths to make sure no one ever found it. The forensic team re-examined the contents of the barrel. Aside from the mix of animal remains, they recovered remnants of decomposed fabric, a cracked plastic hair bead, and one partially melted button. The items were consistent with what Tessa had been wearing that day, based on church photos and family descriptions. But there were no teeth, no skull, no full skeleton, just that single rib. The implications were chilling. Had the rest of her body been scattered or taken elsewhere? The sheriff's office didn't release everything to the public, but internally, the case was reclassified as a homicide. For the first time in 17 years, they had a crime scene. It was minimal, degraded, but it was something. The press latched onto the story, calling it the barrel clue, and flooding social media with images of Tessa's school portrait. Dozens of new tips came in, none useful. Families who had once been at the picnic were contacted again. Some declined to speak. Others asked why the site hadn't been searched sooner. It was a fair question, but one with no good answer. Detectives began combing through old files with fresh urgency. They re-interviewed anyone who had worked the lake, maintained the trails, or lived near the tributary back in 2003. A few names surfaced, Former groundskeepers, seasonal workers, a drifter who'd been squatting in abandoned cabins near the lake during the early 2000s. But none were connected to the Alfords at the time, and none had left behind a solid trail. Still, there was a new tone to the investigation now. The silence around the case had been broken. Tessa's rib had surfaced, and with it came the first undeniable truth in nearly 2 decades. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide her, and they hadn't worked alone. The discovery of Tessa's rib cracked open something the community had sealed off years ago. It stirred a case most had quietly moved past and forced everyone, police, neighbors, volunteers, to confront the possibility that they'd missed something vital. Within 48 hours of the DNA match, deputies, forensic specialists, and search teams were back at the dry creek bed, navigating terrain that had shifted dramatically since 2003. What had once been thick woodland now bore the signs of erosion, wildfires, and flood damage. But despite the years, parts of it had remained surprisingly untouched. The barrel site became the new center of gravity. And it didn't take long for more to surface. Roughly 70 yards upstream from the burial spot, a searcher flagged something unusual sticking out of a sloped embankment, half covered by vines, faintly rust-colored. It was the lid of a dented thermos. Investigators compared it with photos from the Alford residence taken back in 2003. It matched a set from their kitchen cabinet, one of 2 missing thermoses Marianne was known to have packed for the picnic. It was scratched but intact, filled with hardened soil and pine needles. A meter beyond it, a handheld comb with broken teeth and a single blonde strand of hair was pulled from the dirt. Then, something else, fragments of cloth buried beneath leaf rot and flattened branches. It was a floral blouse, faded and discolored by time, its seams frayed and nearly dissolved. But the buttons were still there, dull plastic with a raised ridged edge that matched the ones Marianne had worn the day of the picnic. Several attendees remembered the blouse, pale green with small white flowers. Now it lay curled in the earth, exposed like a wound that had never healed. There were no bones, no shoes, no jewelry. But a portable test identified trace elements of hemoglobin, blood, embedded in the surrounding soil. It had degraded beyond testing, but the sample's depth in the sediment, combined with the fabric remnants, painted a picture investigators couldn't ignore. This wasn't random debris. This was a site of trauma, and it was now considered an unofficial secondary scene. Forensic botanists were brought in to study root growth and soil compaction. They confirmed the ground had been disturbed sometime between June and August of 2003. The natural vegetation above it had regrown with a pattern consistent with something, likely a body, being placed and later moved. But the absence of human remains raised new questions. Had Marianne died there? Had she been left behind? If the blouse was hers, why had only the fabric been found? If she'd died at that location, why remove the body but leave the blouse? And more urgently, where was Greg? If Tessa had been buried in a barrel and evidence suggested Marianne had bled out or been attacked upstream, what happened to the third member of the family? A working theory began to take shape, though quietly. Investigators believed the family may have been separated shortly after leaving the picnic, possibly ambushed or coerced deeper into the woods. That would explain the strange lack of struggle, the absence of screams or calls for help. The spacing between the thermos and blouse suggested a trail, someone moving through the woods either in a hurry or under pressure, someone who dropped things unintentionally. Yet the fact that Tessa's remains were deliberately hidden in a barrel pointed to premeditation. Whoever had been involved didn't panic. They had time. They planned. This theory raised the possibility that Greg himself may have been the last one alive, that he'd fled, died elsewhere, or was somehow complicit. It wasn't a popular idea. Among those who knew him, Greg was remembered as level-headed, protective, and mild-mannered. But 17 years have passed, and assumptions made in grief don't always survive time. Investigators couldn't ignore the fact that his body still hadn't been found. They pulled his employment records, phone logs, and any mention of him in surrounding counties. Nothing. No credit activity. No witness statements placing him anywhere after the disappearance. He was either dead or gone, but both possibilities led to dead ends. The area was searched for days. More fabric scraps were found, none definitively linked to the Alfords. A rusted hair clip, a child's shoelace, pink with a metal aglet. But again, no more bones. The location had been buried under years of storms and sediment. If anything had been left, nature had taken it back. The press began circling again, cautiously. The sheriff's office gave limited updates, choosing to focus on the confirmed evidence. Behind the scenes, there was growing debate about whether the family had encountered a single individual or multiple people. The burial of the barrel, the isolation of the blouse site, and the effort required to cover the tracks suggested someone who knew the woods, someone comfortable in them. The idea that a stranger could randomly abduct and hide 3 people from a crowded church event in daylight seemed increasingly far-fetched. This wasn't opportunistic. This was calculated. And with each day of searching, one question rose higher than the rest. If someone had gone to such extraordinary lengths to bury a child and remove a woman, what exactly had they done with the father? The clue came not from DNA or surveillance or soil analysis, but from a forgotten box in a county archive room. A man named Dennis Ivers, a retired librarian turned historical volunteer, had been cataloging sheriff's records from the early 2000s when he came across a tattered manila folder labeled only Klein H. 2004. Inside were 3 Polaroids, a crumpled intake sheet, and a red spiral notebook, its cover soft from age, the spiral half bent. Ivers wouldn't have thought much of it, except for the date. Harold Klein had been arrested for squatting on federal land just 11 months after the Alfords vanished. The location of his camp, just under 2 miles southeast of the recently discovered barrel site, raised a question that hadn't been asked in nearly 2 decades. Klein was already a footnote in town lore, something between a hermit and a nuisance. In the early 2000s, he had set up an illegal homestead in the woods, building a makeshift shelter out of reclaimed scrap and sheet metal. Game wardens had run him off more than once for unlicensed hunting and trash fires. He was never violent, just odd, kept to himself. I talked too loud to no one. Most people assumed he was harmless. But when Ivers flipped through Klein's old notebook, he froze on a particular entry. It was written in jagged, all-caps handwriting. August 12, 2003. 3 new lights in the woods, 1 small. I watched them for a while, then just silence. They never came back. Investigators were notified the next morning. They hadn't touched the Klein case in years. Most of his belongings had been destroyed or lost after his eviction, but that map, sketched crudely on the last page of the journal, was still intact. It showed a series of hand-drawn trees, uneven lines, and a thick black circle labeled only The Pocket. Klein had also included a cryptic note, "Too quiet there, not right. Stay out." The map was rough, unscaled, but investigators used topographical overlays to match it with real terrain. Within hours, they had triangulated the approximate location of The Pocket, a heavily wooded hollow flanked by 2 ridgelines and shielded by dense overgrowth. It was a place that, despite multiple searches in 2003 and again in 2020, had never been explored. There were no trails, no reason to pass through it, and no public access. Its isolation, combined with its natural camouflage, made it the kind of place someone would choose if they wanted to disappear or hide something. Search teams hiked in slowly, following the ridgeline and comparing landmarks from the journal sketch. They reached the hollow's edge in the early afternoon. The trees there were thicker than anywhere else they'd searched, and the ground sloped in ways that made footing difficult. Every few feet, dogs paused to sniff at nothing. There were no scents they could track, just decades of forest rot and the damp hum of soil. But what struck everyone, almost immediately, was the silence. No birdsong, no insects, just stillness. Within the first 2 hours, they located signs of a past encampment, what appeared to be an old fire ring, blackened stones, rusted tin cans, and a melted flashlight buried beneath rotting leaves. The debris matched items listed in the 2004 arrest report. It was clear Klein had spent time here. Whether he'd seen the Alfords or only imagined them, no one could say for sure. But his words now carried a different weight. He hadn't just recorded what he saw, he'd drawn it. On another page, investigators found a crude sketch of three human figures, two tall, one short, standing beneath tree branches. Scribbled above them were the words, "They glowed like campfires." The drawing was dated the same day as the journal entry. For investigators who had worked the case from the beginning, the implications were chilling. This wasn't just a man seeing lights in the woods. This was someone who may have witnessed the final movements of a missing family and either didn't know what he was seeing or chose not to speak up. The idea that Klein had been living so close to the burial site, and possibly even closer to where the rest of the family had last been, shifted the working theory again. Had he seen something he didn't understand, or something he was afraid to report? Harold Klein died in 2013 from exposure during a record-breaking freeze. He had no next of kin, no known family. His body had been found curled in a drainage pipe near the highway. At the time, no one thought to connect him to the Alfords. But now, investigators wondered whether he had carried something with him for a decade, something he couldn't fully explain. His journal had sat in a dusty evidence box for years. Had someone read it sooner, maybe the hollow would have been searched in time. The team paused their search at nightfall, marking the area for a full excavation the next morning. But even before the first shovel touched earth, they knew something had shifted. The map, the words, the lights, all pointed to the same thing. The truth was out there, hidden just beneath the leaves, and someone, once dismissed as a lunatic, had tried to leave a breadcrumb trail. They just hadn't followed it in time. The area Harold Klein had marked as the Pocket had a local name long before the journal surfaced. Old-timers called it Dead Man's Pocket, a shallow wooded basin surrounded by uneven ridges and prone to sudden flash flooding. It was the kind of place hunters avoided, where compasses spun and boots sank deep into clay, even in dry seasons. The erosion from recent spring storms had ripped through the hollow, peeling back decades of overgrowth. By the time search teams returned with excavation tools, parts of the forest floor had slumped inward, leaving behind a deep, unnatural depression in the earth. Something had collapsed beneath it. 2 cadaver dogs gave alerts within 5 minutes of arrival. The digging started carefully, by hand at first, then with shovels. What they found, buried beneath roots and packed mud, stunned even the most seasoned among them. It wasn't just debris or scattered parts. It was a full vehicle, the outline of a sedan crushed under decades of weight and sediment. The metal was warped and rusted, its frame bent in on itself, the roof buckled as if something above had pressed down slowly over time. But under all of that, just barely legible through the grime, was a corroded Oklahoma plate. The number matched the 2003 registration of the Alford family's Ford Taurus. Investigators halted work immediately and called in the forensics unit. A mobile tent was erected over the site. Floodlights were brought in. Every inch of mud was cleared with surgical precision. When they finally opened the driver's side door, wrenched from its seal after hours of effort, they found skeletal remains still buckled into the seat. The bones were mostly intact, clothes long deteriorated, but the frame was consistent with a middle-aged male. In the passenger seat, the same. Partial remains of a woman curled slightly toward the window, ribs collapsed from the years underground. Based on height, dental structure, and preliminary analysis, the working assumption was immediate. Greg and Marianne Alford had been found. But the inside of the vehicle didn't read like a simple burial site. For one, the doors were locked. All of them. From the inside. Both front seat passengers had been strapped in, but there were no signs of trauma. No fractures that would suggest a crash, no blunt force injury that survived the decomposition process. There was no damage to the undercarriage that matched a fall or collision, and most disturbingly, Tessa wasn't there. There was no child's body. No bones in the back seat. Only 2. Then came the writing. Scrawled faintly into the fogged residue on the interior rear window, barely visible even under angled light, were 4 words. He walked us here. It was written in ink, likely from a ballpoint pen, and degraded with time, but the message was clear. Forensics would later determine it had likely been written from the inside, though moisture and years of pressure had blurred the ink. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace evidence. Just those 4 words and the wide, silent implications of what they might mean. Theories began forming immediately. If the adults had walked into the woods, who was he? And more urgently, who wrote the message? It didn't match anything known to be in Greg's or Marianne's handwriting, though degradation made that difficult to confirm. It also didn't align with Tessa's known script from schoolwork, though investigators couldn't rule it out. Was it a note to be found, a message from someone trapped, a confession, or a warning? Even more perplexing was the state of the car itself. It appeared staged. The placement was too precise, buried beneath earth that had compacted evenly on all sides, with no sign of struggle or chaos. Investigators began to believe the vehicle hadn't ended up there by accident or natural means. It had been placed intentionally and then buried. Soil samples from the site supported that. The compression pattern suggested the car had been positioned first, then layered over. Whoever had done it likely used manual tools, shovels, maybe a makeshift pulley system, but it had taken time and strength, and more than one person. The discovery forced law enforcement to reframe the case entirely. If Greg and Marianne hadn't fled, hadn't crashed, hadn't died together in a tragic accident, then someone had led them into those woods. Someone had orchestrated the separation of their family. Someone had taken their child, left the parents behind, and then gone to great lengths to hide the evidence. The barrel, the blouse, the thermos, they were part of a larger pattern, a map of movement through the forest, each clue planted in isolation, but together forming something darker. The question that haunted every investigator wasn't just who, but how. How had someone moved an entire family without being seen? How had they buried a car in one of the most remote parts of the woods without leaving a trail? And above all, how had that car remained hidden for 17 years beneath ground they'd searched, mapped, and scanned? The excavation team packed up late that evening, but the investigation was far from over. In the morning, they would begin mapping everything surrounding the hollow, trees with broken bark, shifts in sediment, anything out of place. But as they left the site that night, one truth began to settle in. If someone had gone to this much effort to bury Greg and Marianne, then someone else, likely a child, had once walked away. And she had done so knowing something. Something only she or her absence could still tell. The vehicle had already answered questions no one dared to ask, but it hadn't finished speaking. In the days following the excavation, forensic analysts swabbed every inch of the Taurus: steering wheel, door handles, dashboard crevices, the frame beneath the seats, and most critically, the windows. The back right passenger side window, where the chilling message had been scrawled, "He walked us here," yielded something more. Beneath the film of mud, condensation stains, and aging ink, a faint ridge of fingerprint oil was still embedded in the interior glass. The print wasn't complete, partial ridges only, but on the outside of that same window, near the top corner, a full latent fingerprint emerged under ultraviolet light. It didn't belong to Greg, or Marianne, or Tessa. It belonged to someone who should have never been near the car. The print didn't match anyone in the Alford family, or anyone previously interviewed in connection with the case. That alone raised alarms. Then came the hair, short, coarse, and embedded in the front passenger side headrest. It had degraded too far for nuclear DNA, but mitochondrial analysis suggested it belonged to a male, unrelated to the Alfords. Investigators were looking at the near certainty that a fourth person had been inside the vehicle, someone who had been in close physical proximity to Greg or Marianne at the time the car was either buried or staged. The sheriff's office quietly reached out to state and federal databases, submitting the partial fingerprint to every system available. After 2 days of silence, a match came back. It was from an older, pre-2005 arrest booking in Jefferson County, linked to a man named Enoch Voss. Voss had worked as a seasonal groundskeeper and maintenance contractor at Lake Waurika from 1999 to 2002. His name had never surfaced during the initial investigation. He'd been fired a year before the Alfords disappeared after 2 reports of inappropriate behavior toward young campers, though no formal charges had ever been filed. He'd lived alone, no family, no record after 2003. As far as public records showed, he simply vanished. Digging deeper, investigators found that Voss had purchased a plot of land just south of the lake shortly after being fired. It wasn't listed under his name directly, but rather under a shell company formed the month after his termination. The plot included a one-room hunting cabin, off-grid, tucked behind a ridge rarely traveled except by game scouts or survivalists. It had been logged as abandoned in 2004, the same year Klein, the off-grid camper, was arrested and removed from the surrounding area. Records showed no power, no water, no official movement since. The sheriff and lead investigator drove to the property themselves. The road that once led to it was gone, consumed by overgrowth and runoff. They hiked the last half-mile in silence, boots crunching on frost-hardened leaves, uncertain whether they were walking toward an answer or something worse. When they reached the clearing, the cabin stood like a rotting tooth, roof partially caved, door hanging off its hinges, windows shattered. The air inside was thick with mildew and rat droppings, but it wasn't empty. Pinned to one of the interior walls, beneath a cracked panel of drywall, they found a cluster of photos, faded, some torn at the corners. None of them were of the Alfords. They were children, mostly in group settings, church events, school buses, picnics, the kind of shots that could have been taken innocently. Except these had all been cropped, each photo focused on a single child. Some faces were circled in a pen. Others had notes scribbled nearby. Quiet one, likes to wander, keeps to trees. One image had a date in the lower corner, July 2003. The child in that photo was not Tessa, but the location in the background matched the same lake picnic site. In the corner of the cabin, a crawl space. Inside it, a torn piece of vinyl from a car seat, yellowed and cracking. It matched the interior of a Ford Taurus. More concerning was the rusted meat hook hanging from a beam above the crawl space, its purpose unclear, its presence unmistakably deliberate. A small pile of broken dolls sat beside a decayed backpack, the zipper still locked shut with a child's padlock. The property was declared a crime scene. Evidence technicians worked in silence. The team didn't speak much during that first day. Each item logged felt heavier than the last. There was no sign of Voss, nobody. No clue as to what had happened to him after 2004. But it was clear now that he had not simply walked away from the world. He had disappeared into it, embedded himself deep in a place no one had reason to search. Until now. What disturbed investigators most wasn't just that Voss had likely been involved. It was that they didn't know how many others, if any, he'd watched, or followed, or hurt. He had slipped between systems, hidden behind bureaucratic inaction, and when the Alfords went missing, no one thought to mention him. No one even remembered his name. But now they had his fingerprint, his cabin, and the outline of something larger than a single act of violence, something planned, controlled, and far from random. The main room of the cabin was already enough to make experienced investigators uneasy. There were no signs of recent life, no footprints, no fresh debris, no utility access. But tucked between collapsing walls and buckled floorboards were remnants that told a story no one wanted to read. Old newspapers, yellowed and brittle, were stacked near the hearth, each clipped around the same theme, missing persons. Not just the Alfords, but cases from nearby counties and other states. Margins were filled with notes written in a shaking hand. Some pages were circled, others had phrases scribbled across the top. No return, pure ones, the lake listens. On a warped table, investigators found torn notebook paper covered in unhinged ramblings, references to fire, water, cleansing, repeated symbols resembling eyes or suns, and drawings, childlike but disturbing. Stick figures surrounded by what appeared to be flames, trees with sharp black marks, and, most chillingly, crude depictions of a car sinking beneath jagged lines. The images weren't dated, but several were signed at the bottom with a jagged V. They were the only signs that anyone had once tried to explain what happened here, though not in language that made rational sense. It wasn't until a detective stepped on a plank that shifted under his weight that the true depth of the cabin revealed itself. A hidden seam beneath the rug, obscured by mold and dust. A trap door, nailed shut, covered in years of grime. When pried open, it let out the smell of rot and rust, the kind of scent that settled in your throat before you ever smelled it with your nose. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow set of stairs descending into packed earth. The air grew colder with each step. The cellar was no larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were made of hand-dug clay, the ceiling just high enough to crouch. There were 2 mold-stained sleeping bags crumpled in one corner, surrounded by old tin cans, cracked Tupperware, and a broken flashlight. None of the items appeared newer than 2003. One wall had been reinforced with cinder blocks. The others were dirt, their surfaces lined with scratch marks, erratic, overlapping, some faint, some deep. One patch near the entrance was more deliberate, horizontal lines carved carefully in groups of 5, over and over, a tally, days, at least 20. In the dirt near the sleeping bags, they found it. A child's bracelet, pink plastic beads faded and brittle, one of them engraved with a name, Tessa. It was the same bracelet Marianne had described in her last known voicemail to her sister. She'd said Tessa had insisted on wearing it to the picnic that morning, that she wouldn't take it off, even to swim. And now it was here, in the dark, forgotten until now. The scene was processed slowly, every inch photographed, every item was bagged, but no remains were found, no bones, no blood that could still be tested. The cellar wasn't a tomb. It had been a prison, one likely built for one purpose, to contain a child long after the rest of her family was gone. Investigators now believe Tessa hadn't died the same day as her parents. She had been held, possibly for days, even weeks, beneath the earth, fed from cans, left in darkness, and likely alone. The implications shifted everything. The placement of the car, the burial of the barrel, the thermos, the blouse, all of it suggested movement across days, not hours, that the crime had unfolded in stages. The parents had likely been killed, or forced to die, first. Their car was staged, their bodies locked away beneath a sinkhole that hadn't yet formed, and Tessa, for reasons no one could yet explain, had been kept alive. For what? As leverage, out of cruelty? Or because the man who had orchestrated it couldn't bring himself to finish what he started? No trace of Enoch Voss had ever been found, not at the cabin, not nearby, not in any public or private record after 2004. He hadn't been arrested. No sightings had been confirmed. He hadn't used a bank account, filed taxes, or renewed an ID. His presence had vanished just as deliberately as the Alfords once had. The only proof he'd ever existed now lived in fingerprints, pencil marks, and the disturbed earth beneath that forgotten cabin. But the scratch marks on the wall, the rows of quiet counting, told investigators something else. Someone had tried to hold on, to time, to reality, to life. In those 20 marks carved one by one into the wall, there was the silent record of a child who was waiting. For rescue, for escape, for something better than the dark. It would be weeks before the soil gave up its final secret. But when it did, it would prove one thing beyond doubt. Tessa had not waited in vain. In the spring of 2025, southern Oklahoma was hit by its worst flooding in nearly 40 years. Torrential rain hammered the Waurika region for 6 consecutive days. Rivers surged, roads washed out, entire sections of forest eroded under the weight of the water. But for all the destruction it caused, that storm would finally do what 2 decades of searching had not. A week after the rains receded, 2 hikers cutting through the back trails near the old Voss property noticed something unusual along a washed-out creek bend, scattered fragments of bone tangled in uprooted brush. At first, they thought it was animal remains. Then, they found the partial ribcage. Deputies arrived by helicopter the next morning. The area, less than a mile downstream from the buried vehicle site, had been almost impossible to access before the flood. Now the storm had ripped open an exposed shelf of sediment, revealing the partial skeleton of a man. Scattered nearby were shreds of clothing, the remnants of a boot, and beneath a twisted root, the unmistakable glint of rusted steel, a hunting knife, its blade lodged deep in the chest cavity of the remains. The knife was still intact, corroded but stable, embedded between the ribs with a force that suggested intent rather than accident. Within a week, DNA confirmed what the sheriff's office had already begun to suspect. The remains belonged to Enoch Voss. Analysis revealed signs of decomposition consistent with a death that occurred in the summer of 2003. There were no other injuries on the body, no signs of a fight or restraint, just the single fatal stab wound. Tucked inside the shredded remains of a flannel shirt were two fabric fragments, both synthetic, both pink, consistent with the type of material found in the child's bracelet recovered from the cellar. Embedded in the fibers was a faint trace of blood belonging to Tessa Alford. Forensic anthropologists estimated the angle, depth, and placement of the wound. Their conclusion was unsettling and strangely undeniable. The knife had been driven upward, clean between the ribs by someone small, someone right-handed, someone very likely under the age of 12. It was the final piece of a story no one had been able to finish. Tessa hadn't just survived the abduction, she had escaped. At some point, likely days after her parents' deaths, she had broken free from the cellar. Whether it was while Voss slept or when he least expected it, she had found the knife and used it. The location of the body suggested she had dragged or pushed it into the creek bed before the area was swallowed by sediment. The weather that year had been dry, allowing the terrain to quickly absorb what remained. It also explained why cadaver dogs and search crews never picked up a scent. She had buried him without digging. The final moments of her life could only be guessed at. Evidence pointed to her journey across the forest in the days that followed: the thermos, the fabric, the barrel. Investigators believe she attempted to bury her mother, to conceal what had happened. Perhaps in a child's attempt to set things right. She may have gotten lost. She may have succumbed to dehydration or exposure. Her body was never recovered in full. But what she left behind rewrote the ending. She hadn't disappeared without a trace. She had fought, survived, told the story in fragments the only way she could. The Alford case was formally closed that fall. 22 years after they walked away from a Sunday picnic, the family's story was finally known, not through confession, but through the quiet, persistent language of evidence. Scratched cellar walls, a single rib, a rusted car, a message in pen, and a child's final act of defiance that justice had almost missed.